Welcome, everybody, to today's webinar. It's a pleasure to welcome Alan Dillon, whose career has at various points tracked with mine, mostly in Afghanistan, although we never actually worked together. Alan, having been in the Royal Marines, subsequently I think sensibly from a life preservation point of view, moved to the Foreign Office, where things are a bit less hazardous, and not being overburdened with work in the Foreign Office, wrote a book about Captain Shakespeare to begin with, and then finding himself still without enough to do, has now written a book about Lorimer. Who I think is well known to anyone who spent a career involved with the Gulf states in decades past, but has not had really any kind of public profile, partly because he died in rather strange circumstances in 1914, only a couple of years after he had finished his work on the Gazette. And because the Gazette was a classified document, it wasn't until the 1950s that anyone knew that Lorimer had written it. So he's rather been left out of the story until now, and Alan is doing us all a favor, I think, by bringing him out of the shadows where he has previously mostly been. Without taking up any more time, I will simply say that we're very pleased to have Alan with us, and I'll turn over to him. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Everyone, brilliant. The answer was no. Well, thank you very much for coming today. Typical British springtime weather. Another fantastic hidden building, which I was never aware of before. And thank you for giving me the opportunity again to speak about what is one of two passions of mine. And I've always found it a bit of a challenge when deciding how best to deliver this presentation. Whether to focus on Lorimer, a political officer extraordinaire and one of Lord Curzon's chosen few, or the Gazetteer that carries his name, which is a magnum opus and political tool that arguably has as much power and influence now as it did 100 years ago. And as ever, I've settled on a double billing in an attempt to humanize the man who is seldom more than a footnote in the study of history of the Gulf, and to shed a bit more light on the depth and the breadth of knowledge he pursued, even though I seldom do either justice. So who was he? Sir John Gordon Lorimer, more commonly known then as Gordon, was born in Glasgow in June 1870, although he spent most of his childhood in Strathmartin near Dundee. And while some of his forebears had been men of the cloth, including his father, the Reverend Robert, or had served the crown as soldiers in Britain, the Lorimer family was also associated with the crown and service overseas. And it was much the same on his mother, Isabella Robertson's side, who was born and raised during her early years in India, and whose father was murdered in 1857 in Bareilly during the Indian uprising. Now, when I normally talk about political officers or politicals, I usually say that they're ordinary men doing extraordinary things. But when I think of the Lorimer, but also his siblings, I have to conclude that they were all extraordinary. Two of his brothers, David Lockhart Robertson, known to all as Locke, and Robert Campbell, known as Robin, both followed his footsteps to India. Locke initially as an officer in the Indian Army's Queen's Own Guides and Khyber Rifles, and then as a fellow political officer who served alongside his brother in the Gulf and Persia, including posts in Araz, Kerman, Bahrain, Baluchistan, and Gilgit, and who almost lost his life within months of joining the political department when he was attacked by local guides near Luristan. Robin served for 12 years in the Imperial Police, eventually becoming a superintendent in Punjab, until by mutual agreement he took early retirement from the service for being what they perceived to be too progressive and having a strong conscience. Two of Lorimer's other siblings, William Lawton and Elizabeth Hilda, were scholars. William ended his career as a professor of Greek at St Andrews, whilst Hilda spent most of her life at Oxford, at times writing papers on Yugoslavia and Serbia for the Foreign Office. And his two younger sisters, Amelia Stewart and Florence, were a poet and archaeologist respectively. And anyone who's familiar with Sir Aurel Stein's work and his research in Central Asia will in fact be reading Florence's work. But the reason why I argued that the Lorimers were extraordinary was because of a particular behavior at mealtimes that possibly set them all on their respective paths. And that was because they were forbidden by their father to speak English at the dinner table. So they had no choice but to become respectable linguists or risk going hungry. Although mostly homeschooled, Lorimer studied briefly at both the High School of Dundee and the University of Edinburgh before joining Christ Church, Oxford University in 1889, when he became a provisional candidate for the ICS, the Indian Civil Service. And although by that time it was no longer an obligation, ICS candidates were strongly encouraged to study at one of the great academic institutions. But he also enrolled at a prominent London grammar school, Wren & Gurney's, that used to be in Powis Square, the far side of Hyde Park, whose sole aim for a fee was to prepare applicants for public service entrance exams, be they Sandhurst, Colonial and Indian Civil Services, and even the Shanghai Customs Service. And although grammar schools, and Wren & Gurney's in particular, were loathed by the public service commissioners who oversaw recruitment campaigns, no one could argue with their high achievement rates, even if there were some who questioned the colourful character of some of their gentleman candidates. In 1891, after 2 years of study and cramming, then aged 21, which at that time was a cut-off age for applicants wishing to join the ICS, Lorimer passed his final entrance examinations, winning cash prizes for his classical Persian and classical Arabic, Hindustani and political economy papers. Coming top overall in his intake, he had a choice of which region to be sent to, and so asked to go to the Punjab, spending his early service years in the volatile northwest frontier in a variety of roles, from assistant commissioner, revenue officer and settlement officer to district judge and ultimately political officer. Although always recognized by his seniors as a very promising officer, such observations were often followed with a comment about needing more experience or being distracted, which must have grated him. But that changed in 1897 when, despite being a civilian, he earned his spurs as a warrior scholar by accompanying the Tochi Field Force, a sizable military expeditionary force that had been mobilized by the government of India with the task of reprimanding by persuasion, but also by violence, the Darwesh Khel, a Waziri Pashtun tribe that had attacked a small military column passing through its territory. And he excelled at the role, initially advising the field force commander on the political and tribal considerations of the mission, and then supporting a survey team tasked to map Kaitu Valley. And in the subsequent official report to the Viceroy, Lorimer was singled out for his exemplary service, both by the field force commander, but also the officer in command of the survey. And for this, he was awarded the India Medal and the Punjab Frontier Clasp. It was only after his secondment to the Tochi Field Force that Lorimer's reputation changed from being a dependable general administrator to an experienced frontier political officer. And 3 years later, he was again nominated to be part of the military campaign, and this time as a blockade officer in Waziristan to police the Masood tribe. And rather than being seconded to the campaign, he was given the role alongside his normal job as a political agent in Wana, right at the border. And again, he performed admirably, often going out on patrol with Indian and British troops, exploiting his network of local spies and agents to support the campaign. And for this, he received a Waziristan class to add to his India medal. And after 11 years' service, almost exclusively at the frontier, Lorimer was obliged to take furlough, but not before he was also awarded the Companion of the Indian Empire Medal and had published 2 books, arguably the causes of his perceived distractions. The first in 1899 was The Customary Law of the Main Tribes in the Peshawar district, which he modestly called an aid memoir to help judges have a better appreciation of the cultural issues in Peshawar. The second in 1901 on the grammar and vocabulary of Waziri Pashto. And it was as a blockade officer in Wanu that he came to the attention of Louis Dane, the government of India's foreign secretary, the most senior official in the Indian political service, and through him, Lord Curzon, the viceroy, not only for his observations on how to police and govern the frontier, often at odds with the views of his military counterparts, but also how he had successfully converted his words into action. Indeed, Lorimer was just the type of political officer that Curzon wanted working for him, a product of the Indian political service, the only part of the Indian civil service that he had otherwise had little time for. And Curzon held the opinion that it was only at the frontier where political officers could really develop and gain experience. And we get a real sense of Lorimer as a product of empire during his 80-month furlough, as he didn't head straight back to Scotland, despite having been overseas for over a decade. He initially headed to Somaliland, where he tried unsuccessfully to join the latest British military campaign against the Mad Mahdi of Sudan. And arriving too late to join the expedition, he instead approached the nearest colonial office and registered to take the official Swahili language exams, with very little preparation, and passing them, adding to his list of language qualifications. He even briefly considered transferring to the colonial service to work in the region, but quickly became dissuaded from his potential career change after he passed through Zanzibar, Uganda, and Djibouti. He then headed north, eventually setting himself up at the Turf Club in Cairo, staying there for a few months to take in the culture, and where he put himself forward to take the British military's Arabic interpreter exams, the highest level of qualification, again passing it with some ease. When he finally returned home in the early spring of 1903, having avoided the Scottish winter, he was introduced to his future wife, Marion Agnes MacLean, otherwise known as Nesta. And as he was due back in India later that year, that summer he started to make plans for what he assumed would be a return to the frontier, having already been offered a job as a settlement commissioner in Kashmir. All that was needed to confirm his posting was for Dane, the Foreign Secretary, to approve the move. Both Dane and Curzon, however, already had their own plans for how to employ Lorimer, despite him having been away from India for over a year. And rather than return to the mountains, they wanted him placed on special duty in the Gulf, despite having never worked there, a duty that was to begin immediately as soon as he and Nesta landed in India in early November. Curzon's exact demand for Lorimer was to produce a book of reference in which the history of every political question or relationship affecting this region can be traced from the beginning. And to achieve this feat, both Curzon and Dane agreed that 6 months would be a sufficient amount of time. Even Lorimer thought that half a year was acceptable, even suggesting that he could do the Gazetteer alongside working as a district judge in Dera Ismail Khan, back at the frontier. And he even got his wish, although he lasted less than a month in the courtroom before he was overwhelmed, physically and mentally, by the special duties requirements. And it was perhaps another sign of the times that on the very day Lorimer and Nesta arrived in Bombay, having spent the last 4 weeks together on a passenger ship for what was effectively the honeymoon, having married just a couple of days before leaving Scotland, He received orders to join Curzon and his party in Karachi straight away. And leaving Nesta with all of the confusion and chaos that comes with any new posting overseas, he made his way to the port city to be greeted by a formidable flotilla of Indian and Royal Naval warships and auxiliary vessels that would make up Curzon's grand tour of the Gulf. A 5-week vice-regal cruise that would take him Muscat, Sharjah, Bahrain and Kuwait on the Arab coast, and Bandar Abbas and Bashir on the Persian side. Along the way, taking some discreet reconnaissance of islands and waterways, including Kishim and Hormuz Islands. Sorry. Okay. Since becoming Viceroy in 1899, Curzon had pressed Whitehall several times for permission to tour the region. But with the British government and its military consumed by the Boer War, there was little appetite to let a loose cannon like Curzon potentially agitate the Ottoman Sublime Porte at the periphery of their caliphate, which might then need a strong British political or military intervention. But when Foreign Secretary Lord Lansdowne announced in May 1903 that the British must retain their superiority in the Gulf, that was all Curzon needed to hear to pursue his own agenda. And if Lansdowne's statement looks familiar, it's because the last paragraph was paraphrased in the 1980 Carter Doctrine, a case of history repeating. Curzon's grand tour was to be a formidable show of British prowess and dominance in the Gulf. It was pomp, circumstance, and gunpowder, a blend of both soft and hard power to deter any Russian, European, or Ottoman interest, to reassure the various Arab leaders on Britain's commitment to them under the long-established maritime treaty, but also a reminder to them that should their allegiances or interests wander too far, they could expect the full force of the British Navy to show them the error of their ways. And arguably, some of the same subliminal messaging was aimed at the Shah and his regional governors. The secondary reconnaissance mission was to identify potential locations for naval bases, should the Royal Navy need to increase its presence in the Gulf, if Curzon's subtle messaging was ignored. And the Grand Cruise was part of a reintroduced forward policy following a period of splendid isolation, or what was wonderfully termed masterly inactivity. And it is worthy of the cliche, a game of two halves, insofar that Curzon had all the pomp and ceremony, sycophancy flags and gun salutes that matched and fed his ego when he met prominent Arab leaders. But it was a rather colorless affair during his Persian stopovers, having been given very little time or interest from either the Shah or his delegated representatives. And looking at Lorimer's special duty, it is rather questionable how he, Dane or Curzon, ever thought he was going to be able to achieve anything by being on the cruise, as he spent no time ashore or engaged with any of the foreign dignitaries or their parties. And although he was additionally tasked to be the Viceroy's translator, he instead found himself running all of the program's administration while Curzon, Dane, and the other senior dignitaries swarmed around in full regalia. Here we have a grainy plate, which you can just about make out Curzon in a full gown and regalia, sitting on what appears to be a golden throne, with a mass of British civilian and military officials in full dress, both behind him and to his left and right. The various emirs from the trucial states sat in their glitterers and bish cloaks. I should add that this took place during Ramadan. It was only when the ships had arrived back in Karachi in early December that Lorimer was finally able to lay down some roots with Nesta and to begin to work through the various government archives, libraries and registries which had held all of the correspondence and reports of the region, all the way back to the early days of the Portuguese and the East India Company's presence in the Gulf. After receiving a year's extension by Curzon, based himself in Simla, Lorimer was allowed to assemble a small team to support him. They were Jerome Saldana, who was an Indian judge in the Indian Civil Service. And I've deliberately referenced Saldana's nationality because there were in fact two Indian civil services, the covenanted which was solely British officers, typically never more than 1,100 strong, and then the Uncovenanted, staffed by Indian or Indigenous officers, a service that was many times the size of the former. Then there was John Gaskin, a seasoned political officer with time in the region, who was of Anglo-Indian descent and as a result of his lineage was also of the Uncovenanted Indian Civil Service. Lieutenant Cecil Gabriel from the 37th Baluch Lancers was also part of the team, a British soldier who volunteered to join the mission during his local leave as a means to move across to the political service. And he was joined by Lieutenant Frederick Hunter, a Canadian by birth, who had just transferred from the Duke of Connaught's own Bombay Lancers to the Survey of India's trigonometrical branch based in Dehradun. And finally, there was the very experienced and highly decorated surveyor, Khan Bahadur Shirjung, also from the ICS, who was a recent recipient of the Royal Geographical Society's Black Memorial Sword of Honour. Lorimer and his team had just one opportunity to visit the region to gather information and to survey the landscape, mostly retracing Curzon's route, although they were also able to penetrate into the hinterland, particularly in Kuwait and Iraq, Mesopotamia, although the Ottoman authorities refused them permission to stop over in Arabia's eastern Al-Hassa province because they feared that Lorimer might observe that the governance of the area was extremely weak. And to help facilitate access and to tease information out of anyone of interest, Lorimer could draw from a small Secret Service fund to offer cash payments in exchange, as well as a bundle of gifts which ranged from silver watches and hunting knives to handheld telescopes and pistols. But given the scale of the task, Lorimer soon acknowledged that he had to rely heavily on a peer and rival, Sir Percy Cox, the political resident in Bashir, and his growing network of political agencies scattered around the Gulf and Persia's south and southwestern hinterland, also part of Curzon's forward policy, to collate information on his behalf. And here you can see some of the consular parishes that the political officers were obliged to manage at that time. Some, like Locke in Awaz, Lieutenant Birdwood in Bashir, and Lieutenant Shakespeare and Bandar Abbas, embraced this task with some energy, traveling extensively in their respective areas, while others with a few more years' service under the belts were less enthused. Gazetteering also had to be carried out discreetly in areas nominally governed by the Ottoman, such as Al-Hassa and Qatar, while in Trucial Oman, what we now know as the UAE, there was no established agency or permanent posting at all. And totally committed to his duty, Lorimer would additionally ask any official mission or delegation passing through the region to carry out supplementary observations in support of his mission, often providing them with a questionnaire that covered all aspects of demography, geography, and sociology of interest. And another key source of information was pulling anything of relevance and utility from over 770 books and publications, all of which were referenced in the Gazetteer, although the true number of tomes and reports that Lorimer would have worked through would undoubtedly be much more, as he would have disregarded other publications, either because of irrelevance, duplication, or lack of credibility. And worthy of note is the fact that only 11 works were written by non-Europeans. And the female contribution was even less, with just British travellers, ladies Isabella Bishop, Anne Blunt, Ella Durand, and Mary Shill Hunter. Ella Sykes, sister of Sir Percy, were also quoted in the Gazetteer, alongside the Czechoslovakian Matilda Helfer and Jeanne Delafoy from France. I mean, this was Boyd's own stuff, pure Orientalism. And still no nearer an end product, a new 12-month special duty was granted, followed a year later with another 12-month extension, and then another. But then the bookkeepers got involved. The finance department had grown weary of Lorimer and the political department's requests for more time and money. And it was now the summer of 1908, nearly 5 years since the Gazetteer had been commissioned. But not only had the accountants had enough of the empire's eternal pursuit of knowledge in the Gulf, Lorimer too had grown sick of his work and had even suggested several times during his lowest points that maybe someone else at a lower grade should continue his work to reduce costs. But each time, Lewis Dane declined to consider his suggestion, arguing that there was now no one in the political service with his depth of knowledge. Compared to the amount of funds being spent to survey and gazetteer parts of India, the cost of keeping Lorimer on task was minimal, but with the bean counters unconvinced of the government of India's interest in the Persian Gulf, an interest which they strongly believed was down to peer pressure and only because of the Foreign Office's interest. A wholly inaccurate judgment, as the Foreign Office was totally committed to the relationship with the Turks and recognized their sovereignty over Central Arabia. But a compromise had to be found. And despite Lorimer's reservations, it was agreed that the Gazetteer should be in two parts. The first to publish at the end of the year, with the expectation that the second would publish shortly after, once Lorimer had carried out a final editorial sweep. And so it was on Christmas Eve 1908, back in Strathmartin on Thurlow, Lorimer penned the foreword to Volume 2 so that the final copy could go to the printers. But it would be another 7 years before the first volume of the Gazetteer was finalized, by which time Lorimer's special duty had finally come to an end. He spent another year's furlough back in Scotland, being posted for 4 years as the Consul General and political resident in Baghdad, which was considered by Gertrude Bell to be the gateway to Arabia and the most important residence in the region. Attended the Delhi Durbar in 1911, and then from late 1913 to early 1914, replaced Cox as a political resident in Bashir, arguably against his wishes. I'm going to leave this rather meager pen portrait of Lorimer with you on a cliffhanger, as I've had to omit huge swaths of his life, including the unusual circumstances of his death in Bashir in February 1914, aged just 43. And that's because I want to spend the remaining time on his legacy, the Gazetteer. But before I do, I'd just like to add a bit more color about the man himself. He was a family man, a father to 2 daughters, Jean Mary, born in 1904, and Isabella Lockhart Bell in 1907. He was a religious man. He read the Bible daily with his wife Nesta and was known to lead the Sunday service. He was a sportsman who played mixed doubles tennis with Nesta against other political missions, a capable hunter with a rifle, an equestrian, and although mostly masked, he also had a sense of humor, either dressing up in fancy dress when hosting balls at his residence in Baghdad, or organizing al fresco silver service dinner functions on the banks of the River Tigris. He was also a very astute political operator and highly respected by his peers and associates, both British and foreign. And what about the Gazetteer? We're looking first at Volume 2, or what Lorimer coined a geographical dictionary. It is just shy of 2,000 pages and has 791 unique entries, beginning with Abidala, a tribe of Trushal Amal with 200 houses at Sharjah town, and ending with Zabara, a ruined and deserted town on the west side of the Qatar promontory. And where appropriate, entries were referenced or supported by footnotes. Cross-referencing with other Gazetteer entries was also possible by highlighting the subject in bold throughout the book. Another mark of the man is the fact that he acknowledged and referenced his Gazetteering team throughout, as well as the various political agents and missions where they contributed. It has countless tables of data in an attempt to measure, count, and quantify everything, from pearling quotas and livestock to a town or tribe's fighting strength, number and type of rifles held. Information that was useful for both policy and war planners alike. A controversial and unpopular transliteration model was also used, and when it came to estimating time and distances, Lorimer included a caveat that where they came from native sources, they were not to be relied upon. And there's another caveat which I like, which says that if water is reported to be good, it probably means nothing more than its taste is not disagreeable and can be drunk with impunity by the locals. And although many of the political authors in the region at the time were prolific photographers, it's unfortunate that just 56 photographs were included. Now, Volume 2 is a truly remarkable piece of work. It's also rather addictive insofar that if you're not careful, you can end up spending hours immersed in its contents. And as for its accuracy, just a few years ago, the New York University in Abu Dhabi carried out some mapping of pearl banks and camel stocks in the Gulf, wells in Qatar, and date palms in Bahrain, using Volume 2 as a reference point, and found that the vast majority of the data sets provided still had a high level of accuracy. And for the vast majority of researchers, Volume 2 provides more than enough to help inform an understanding of a place, person, or tribe. And it's rather frustrating that even the handful of academics who criticize Lorimer's work because of its obvious bias still quote him extensively. And Volume 1 is also a veritable feast, one which attempts to mop up everything else that Lorimer felt was needed to ensure that Curzon's original terms of reference were fully met. And whereas Volume 2 was bound in just one book, Volume 1 is comprised of 4, but it should really be recognized as 3 more unique bodies of reference. Parts 1A and B, a total of just over 1,600 pages, cover the history of the numerous emirates, Oman Sultanate, and regions in the Arabian Peninsula and Northern Arabia, in parts going back as early as the early 1400s. Part 2, which is another 1,100 odd pages, continues where Part 1 left off, but focuses on Persia, with historical chapters on Arabistan, the Persian coast, and Persian Makran, with the earliest substantial reference dating back to 1258, with the siege of Alamut Castle in Qazvin province. But Part 2 also includes 17 appendices on a diverse range of subjects from health, geology and trade to telecommunications, arms trafficking, epidemics and slavery. All themes of strategic interest to the British at that time, and 100 years on still are. It also includes a wonderful monograph of Curzon's Grand Tour, written by Lorimer, who witnessed the whole affair. And then there is Part 3, a catalogue of geological trees of all the prominent Arab tribes, families. And if any of you are familiar with Michael Field's collection of family trees, I do encourage you to look at the Gazetteer to see where he got his inspiration. And Part 3 concludes with a map of the various pearling banks scattered along the Arabian coastline, at that time the primary form of trade and export. Beyond a few rough sketches, there is a notable absence of maps in either volume. It was Lorimer's original intent to include a variety of maps in different scales, but when he was overruled by the Indian Surveyor General, he set to produce a single map of the region instead to complement the Gazetteer, more commonly known as Hunter's Map, after its creator. Lorimer called it the most accurate map of the Arabian interior, and it was used extensively by St. John Philby when he started exploring the interior a few years later. But when it was first published in 1909, it was immediately discredited by the War Office, who said it was fit only to turn face to the wall because of the methods used. And using a scale of 32 miles to an inch, a ratio that was used throughout the British Empire's surveillance bodies at that time, it was theoretically possible to join all of these planning maps together to have the whole of the British Empire in a single visual installation if you had a wall big enough. And as you can make out here, the map itself was 4 large individual sheets, giving you an indication of its size. Despite the War Office's reaction to the map, it was kept updated by the Indian Survey Office. As a result, there were several versions of Hunter's Map, one of which includes a table of over 2,000 place names and their coordinates, the majority produced and introduced at Lorimer's insistence, which would have otherwise been omitted from the Gazetteer altogether, either because nothing else was known about them or because they were too insignificant to have unique Gazetteer entry. And whereas Volume 2 was factual, Volume 1 was subjective, selective, extremely personal and critical in parts, and naturally biased given both its purpose and the origin of most of its primary sources. And to quote a 1970 book review of the Gazetteer, the only one conducted after the Gazetteer was finally made public, there is a bland assumption of the eternal wisdom and benevolence of the imperial policy. A fair point, although even with that comment, the reviewer was also of the view that it was indispensable for anyone seriously interested in the Gulf, a view that still holds firm today. And the reviewer in question was Professor Robin Bidwell, the then Secretary of the Middle East Centre at the University of Cambridge and former political officer in Aden. Classified as secret from the offset, and with less than 150 of either volumes ever printed and distributed throughout the region and in key embassies, the Gazetteer was meant to be kept under lock and key when not in use, until it was finally released to the public in the early 1950s. Although even then, controls were in place to restrict access. And Hunter's map was similarly classified as secret and initially subject to tight controls. And such is the power of its contents that in the pursuit of oil in the 1940s and 50s, it was used extensively by the Saudi government and Aramco to try to prove sovereignty in disputed parts of the peninsula, including the Bahraini oasis in the then true Sulaman. And it even ended up as a primary source during the Bahraini Arbitration Tribunal in Switzerland. The Gazetteer was also a primary source of reference used by the Sultanate of Oman and Pakistan during the sale of Gwadar in 1953, as they negotiated to agree the enclave's boundaries. And it was called on again in 1967, this time by the UN, when the organization was tasked to oversee Bahrain referendum on independence and to counter the efforts by the Iranian authorities to claim that they had sovereignty over the island. More recently, the Gazetteer was quoted extensively by both the Bahrainis and Qataris at the International Court of Justice in the late 1990s and 2000s to help finally resolve their various island and maritime border disputes. And some of the Qatari claims were ultimately refuted as they had used a poorly translated version of the Gazetteer to support the case, which was then challenged by the Bahraini legal team, whose own copy was more accurate. And I'd like to just finish off this final observation. There are now only a handful of complete volumes still in existence. Some were deliberately destroyed in vulnerable agencies and consulates at the beginning of the First World War to prevent the German and Ottoman authorities from getting their hands on them. Others were probably weeded out of embassy libraries by energetic third secretaries who were ignorant of their value. No doubt others were spirited away by political officers, residents, and ambassadors who weren't. And of those I've been able to track down, one complete set is currently locked away in a bank vault in Geneva as part of the arbitration papers and can only be accessed in the presence of both the British and Saudi ambassadors resident there. Arguably, there are two, maybe three gazetteers still in service in our embassies, one in Abu Dhabi and in Bahrain, while the FCDO's library copy, originally distributed to the Arab Bureau in Cairo, is in its historical collection in King's College, London. And I remember when I asked Abu Dhabi colleagues if they could take a photograph of the various serial numbers written at the front of their gazetteer volumes, they initially refused because they said it was a secret document. Even when they eventually gave me the serial numbers, they probably thought they were breaking the Official Secrets Act. And outside of government, I have managed to track down a few more, mostly in universities, society libraries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to open the floor to questions.
Bill Woodburn, former Trush-Lomond scout, where we had a copy of Lorimer's Gazetteer. So I bought your book, and I commend you on the huge amount of work that's gone into it. It's an incredible document. My question is, if Lorimer hadn't accidentally died when he did, where do you think his career might have taken him after Bashir?
That's a very good question. He still hadn't finished the Gazetteer when he died. I think he would eventually publish that. I think he had had no choice but to have signed that off. I think what would have happened, and I know counterfactual is something that should be discouraged. I think when the Indian Expeditionary Force went to Abadan oil fields and Mesopotamia, I think it would have been Lorimer rather than Cox who would have been the senior political advisor there. And I hope that his judgment would have been different to both Cox's and the military commanders. And I think we might not have seen the siege of Kut. Where he would have gone after that, I don't know. But I think the Mesopotamian campaign would have been very different had Lorimer been alive.
That was great, Alan. Really, really interesting.
Thank you.
Was the same process carried out anywhere else in the empire or in the world? And if well, and why did it happen in the Gulf? It was only the Gulf.
The Indian Civil Service was constantly gazetteer in India. And I mean British India as a whole, not just India itself. So there were various gazetteers at both a sort of country and a sort of province level. Only Curzon had the vision to gazetteer the Gulf. I think if Curzon hadn't been viceroy, that probably wouldn't have been commissioned. When Lorimer's Gazetteer finally published, there was a slight moving of the deck chairs insofar that the Colonial Office then took over sort of foreign policy ownership of most of Central Arabia after the First World War. And they did write a follow-up Gazetteer of Arabia, which was more plagiarized elements of Lorimer's book with just a little bit more added from the Arab Bureau. But it was regular activity throughout the Indian Civil Service to Gazetteer.
The Survey of India produced two extremely detailed maps marked season 1904-05, one of Bahrain and one of Muscat. I'd always assumed this was part of Lorimer's project, and I don't know whether there were other maps produced as well.
Yeah, so that was Shir Jung's work. He also mapped parts of Kuwait, parts of Bashir, and I think he tried to do a bit more in the sort of area between the sort of Trush-Lomond and Muscat, but I can't recall whether he actually finished that because he was accompanying Cox on another expedition. But yeah, initially that was to be part of the Gazetteer, but Lorimer had a sort of a difference of opinion with the Surveyor General. They certainly didn't have a close relationship, and there was a point when the Surveyor General referenced Lorimer as your man here when he was talking to Lewis Lane. So for whatever reason, I think because that relationship was never established, those maps were never included in the Gazetteer.
Thank you very much. I have seen, because the ISAA has a copy of the reprint of the Gazetteer, but could you say how reliable, how accurate that is? Was it?
I think about 4 or 5 different publishing houses printed runs in 1970, Well, I think they're like 11 volumes. I think they are exactly the same. The Gazetteer's shortfall was the fact it does not have an index. Although volume 2 has this sort of rather clever cross-referencing capability, and volume 1 has a really well-developed table of contents, there isn't an index, which was one of the things which the bean counters and Lorimer sort of disagreed on. I spent 3 months indexing both. So actually my book, there's a 70-page index which supports a gazetteer.
There's one question that I know a member watching online was keen to ask is, what did Lorimer's family, and I'm conscious that there are members of the family here, but what did Lorimer's immediate family do after his death? Because this was obviously an unexpected event.
Thank you for putting me on the spot on that one. So Nestor, I think, was effectively shipped out of Bashir within 5 days of Lorimer being buried. They had very, very little time to pack up their belongings. Some of it was auctioned off locally, but she was escorted back to the UK by a military officer who was in the residency at the time. I couldn't tell you how much. I mean, obviously it impacted heavily on the family, particularly his brother Locke, who I think probably went into depression around that time. He had some illnesses at the time, but I think the death of his elder brother really hit him hard. But the daughters were back in Scotland at the time. He was in Bashir just with his wife. I couldn't tell you about the impact on the wider family, but it certainly would have devastated them.
One more question.
I think I can comment a little bit on what happened with the wider family. I think it was a devastating event because he was the oldest of 8. The second youngest was my grandfather, and they gathered in his family. His father had retired as the incumbent at Strathmartin, and they were resident in various watering holes in Europe, and they gathered together in Lausanne, I think. And they were great correspondents, and they wrote letters constantly to each other, but there's almost no reference to anything about Gordon except about the arrangements that must be made in order for them to get from their various places to where they would gather together. And this is remarkable, really, in a sense, because I think it's of the time and of their particular background that there wasn't really the possibility of expressing their grief. And it finds its way out, in a sense, in their intense application to their work. So they all succeeded in well, 5 of the 8 of them made remarkable contributions to scholarship. But I think this trauma was just right. Never really was. It wasn't possible to deal with it in their own life.
Thank you very much indeed for sharing your family knowledge. We're going to close for today. Thank you very much to those of you who are here in the room, and thank you to those who are joining us online. Our next meeting will be an online meeting on the 7th of May on the Catholic Church in Asia, scheduled before the Pope died, although it was pretty clear that he was ailing. And it's an aspect of Asia that is often overlooked because we tend not to think of Christianity as a major force in much of Asia, but there are substantial Christian communities scattered all over, and the Catholic Church is, of course, particularly strong in the Philippines, but in other places as well. So I hope you will be interested to join us on the 7th of May for that occasion. And for now, thank you all very much indeed, and goodbye.